Hello and welcome to the October 31st edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. So it is Halloween, and as befitting the holiday, I have a scary story for you. A scary story about a haunting. The haunting of the persistent demands for negotiations being put on Ukraine by the United States government. Truly the most horrifying ghost of all. Yes, once again, in this persistent cycle of the United States, or Trump himself, truly first getting the idea in his head that he would finally bring Ukraine and Russia to the table to settle the war, only to then be frustrated in his failures shortly thereafter, shutting up for, I don't know, maybe a month or two, and then getting back on it again. At this point, as reliable as the rising and receding of the tide. But before we go on, I would like to say that if you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, and we'll be needing more support in the near future, all things considered, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. I have a few more projects coming up that could use your support, including the Radio Free America podcast, where our co-host Romeo has a rotating cast of guests to critique the mainstream media in the United States, as well as my ongoing video project of the polycrisis, the ways in which the world is falling apart, along with a few more irons that happen to be in the fire. So to support Ukraine Without Hype, again, patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype, and on with the show. This time around, the push from the White House for peace negotiations seems to come from a particular fixation that President Donald Trump seems to have, which is that he really wants a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, some of this is that Trump really loves his symbolic gestures, his gold even, but really what I think this boils down to is that Barack Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize, and Trump is not happy with that hanging over him. Now, I don't believe that Obama deserved a Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, it was given to him pretty much immediately after taking office before he had the opportunity to do much to even go into consideration for any kind of prize, and I don't think his presidency, in hindsight, really met the occasion for it. It was mostly a gesture of the Europeans being glad that the George Bush presidency was over and hoping that things could get better. But the point is that Obama has one, and Trump is spending his entire presidency since really his entire life since the Obama presidency with a deep bitterness over it. In fact, if you want to have your cinematic moment that may have kicked Trump into the modern political scene, even though he had been involved in the 80s, the Reform Party and all that, was through Obama basically mocking Trump that he was not president and that Obama was. And that bitterness, that personal enmity that he has for Obama can only be healed once he is able to upstage Obama in this way. I think that might be the core of his obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize. If you listen to or watch, it was a video episode, the first episode of Polycrisis on the various wars happening in the world, I mentioned how the United States is interjecting itself in many global conflicts, making itself look like a mediator, even in the many cases where it is in fact not one, and demanding Nobel Peace Prize as a result of that. Primarily the Armenia-Azerbaijan not quite peace deal. Again, watch that episode, it's complicated. Both sides walked away from it, nominating Trump for the prize. And he really seemed to try to fit in the Israel-Gaza peace deal, as flimsy as it may currently look, into this award campaign, though unfortunately for him did not meet the deadline for it. Well, of course, Ukraine, in order to play into Trump's obsessions, did say that if America could figure out a solution to the ongoing war, they would nominate Trump for the prize as well. We'll get into some of that later. But before talking about the current push for a peace deal, I'd like to talk about some of the past attempts that the Trump White House has been making, because it has been so cyclical, because it has been so chaotic and back and forth. And that really begins with his promise made on basically the first day of his presidency, he said that he would end the war on his first day. That obviously did not take place, and it was since treated as a rhetorical flourish more so than an actual promise. But these attempts started very early, so in February. Again, right after the inauguration, there was the summit in Riyadh between the United States and Russia. This was a high-level meeting between the Secretary of State as well as their Minister of Foreign Affairs to discuss the possibility of improving U.S.-Russian relations and testing the waters of what a peace deal would look like on Ukraine. Now, this was mostly a waste of time. Pretty much everything I'm going to talk about right now has been a tremendous waste of time, so to avoid saying this was a waste of time after every single sentence, just mentally lock that in. But this did set the initial tone that this would be a meeting between the United States and Russia, not with Ukraine. The world's problems would be handled between the superpowers. The superpowers would decide on the fate of weaker countries. And this Riyadh summit was shortly followed up by his new fixation on a so-called mineral deal. Now, as Trump described this mineral deal, what it basically would come down to, as it appeared in US media, was that Ukraine would give up control over its natural resources to the United States as a back payment for the aid that was already rendered. A disgusting and ultimately non-existent deal. Because while the mineral deal was eventually signed, it looked nothing like that. The mineral deal, in reality, is basically just an investment fund that doesn't actually involve Ukraine having to give anything up. Whatever negotiators were involved in that deal, they knew to play into Trump's need for catchphrases and rhetorical comfort rather than actual policy. So they gave him the mineral deal that he wanted, but not the contents that he would have wanted. But that February turned into also a true low point in American-Ukraine relations. President Zelensky went to Washington, D.C. in order to finalize this mineral deal, and while he was there, he was ambushed by J.D. Vance and a crowded room full of people who yelled at him and lectured him, causing Zelensky to leave town early in the middle of a diplomatic disaster. A disaster that the Ukrainian side had to put a tremendous amount of effort in order to patch up. Even got the Pope involved at one point. So that was February already and on to March. Into March was all these proposals for ceasefires. Initially, the idea would be that there would be a 30-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, which Ukraine accepted and, of course, Russia denied. This eventually mutated into an energy ceasefire, where the two sides agreed not to attack the other's energy infrastructure, which Russia violated within 2 hours. You can't trust Russia, point being, and all this time, there are different proposals for ceasefires and this and that during this time, Ukraine went out of its way in order to look like the accommodating party, and Russia the one stalling and preventing Trump from getting his laurels. So everything that the Americans proposed, Ukraine said yes to. Even when, quite frankly, these were bad and stupid proposals, Ukraine knew that it could just say yes because they weren't going to happen anyway because Russia wouldn't accept it. There wasn't really a losing part of that. And this did seem to work a bit. And there was a bit of a rapprochement. J.D. Vance even through his teeth, you could tell his reluctance to do so, and did so in the presence of the Pope, again, at one point. Such a weird meeting. To have a bit more cozy relations with Zelensky and the diplomatic team. And so through the summer, it seemed as though the Trump White House had largely, though in April, there was another terrible statement where the Trump White House essentially offered that Russia could keep the annexed territories and America would offer it some level of recognition. Just gruesome, stupid things. But through the summer, Trump seemed distracted. Most of the intention of American foreign policy was on Israel-Gaza. That gave Ukraine some reprieve. When Trump is paying attention to you is when things have the opportunity to go bad, when Trump is not paying attention to you, things can kind of scoot forward without much interruption. And that's kind of the ideal that we're going for here. Though keep in mind that during all this time, American aid for Ukraine is over, never resumed. Military aid gone, civilian aid gone, intelligence aid still existing, but even that was withdrawn until eventually being returned at some point. And this improvement lasted until August, which was the Alaska Summit, which we had a whole episode titled dedicated to, where Vladimir Putin came to the United States itself. Alaska, a former part of the Russian Empire, was chosen for this, which the Russians really ate up, to give it another try. Now, why the timing for August was going to be when we go over the current negotiation process, this will be a repeating theme, is that before the August summit, there was a ticking time on when there would be sanctions against Russia, or specifically the Russian fossil fuel industry. And by having this Alaska summit, those sanctions were able to be postponed in order to not mess up diplomatic agreements. Though India was hit by secondary sanctions before the White House decided to go easy on Russia. Again, see my episode about the Alaska Summit for more details on that. And I was certainly pessimistic about this Alaska Summit for the same reasons that I mentioned about the Riyadh Summit. This was the great powers coming together to decide the fate of weaker countries, which is always a bad thing. However, the actual results of this summit were not to Russia's liking, at least in the specifics. In the grand scheme, yes, having this meeting met Russia's larger goals of having a seat at the imperial table. But on the smaller scale, not so much. And that largely had to do with the opposite of Ukraine's strategy. So as I said, Ukraine's strategy has been to flatter Trump's ego at every opportunity. That's kind of how you have to handle him. He is a malignant narcissist who needs to be constantly pumped up, constantly be told he's the smartest, most specialist boy in the world. And if you keep doing that, maybe in some way you'll get something out of him. I think that this is often counterproductive, but it is the strategy that was chosen, and there has been some benefit from it, at least averting the worst of Trump's maliciousness. It hasn't led to things good coming to Ukraine, but it has led to bad things staying away from Ukraine anyway, if that makes any sense. The Russians, on the other hand, who are normally very good at this. The Russians are typically extremely good at exploiting the fixations and ideological weaknesses of their opponents. Russian propaganda in the United States is typically not really about Russia. It is often focused on culture war issues that serve to cause chaos in the American political sphere while boosting far-right reactionary forces. That's their main deal, and they're successful at it. And their success at that and their ability to know their enemy in that way seems to fall apart at the higher levels. If you get Vladimir Putin or one of his other higher-ups into a room with Trump, they don't know how to handle themselves. They have too much ego. Vladimir Putin cannot, on a mental level probably, bring himself to be too flattering to Donald Trump. He is the one that gets flattered. He's not the one that does the flattering. He is at the top of the pyramid. The ass-kissing moves upwards. That's how it goes. It's a chain that goes upwards, and he's at the top. He doesn't do it to others, and he can't do it to Trump. And so, through some of the leaks about what happened at the Alaska Summit, we know that rather than flatter Trump, Putin instead decided to give him a lecture on medieval Rus history, talking about the grand princes of Kievan Rus and how Russia is the inheritor of that, and how Western forces have peeled away the grand legacy of Yaroslav the Wise and all that. Go to my history episode, I talk about that. I don't know. And I cannot imagine Donald Trump sitting for an hour-long history lecture. That is the most absurd, funniest idea in the world, of him just sitting there and being like, yeah, yes, that's very interesting. I agree with what you say about the baptism of Kiev and how that means that Crimea is eternal Russian territory. He just doesn't have the attention span for that. And apparently he got very angry at this history lecture, leading to the event being called off early and Putin going home, apparently with the meal even being canceled. I just don't understand why Putin would think that would be a good idea. I don't see why Putin thinks anything he does is a good idea, but a little bit of prep, I guess. And so, since August, it's only the end of October right now. For all the changes that are happening, it's not in a large time scale. America, specifically Trump, blessedly lost interest again. And so September, thankfully, had a whole month and a half of America minding its own business in regards to Ukraine, and what a blessed month and a half that was until the middle of October, which brings us to our our current state of things. And so in the beginning of October, we had some good signs coming out of the United States. Three of them I'll be paying most attention to. One, a sanctions package and the Senate seemed to have wanted to move forward. A sanctions package on Russian businesses being passed through what counts as the pro-Ukraine faction within the U.S. Senate, headed up by Mitch McConnell and others. Bipartisan bill to put more sanctions on Russia. It has been waiting. It was pretty much written right away with the Trump presidency and just has been sat upon since then, but it looked like there could have been some forward movement on it. Next, there was permission to use Storm Shadow missiles. The Storm Shadow is a British-French missile that had been allowed to use for closer range strikes, particularly in occupied territory such as Crimea. But the United States had been withdrawing its permission to use the Storm Shadow because of various components that it was not solely a British-French production. The Americans were involved in it as well and had a say in the use of Storm Shadows and used that say to veto its use when it comes to deep strikes within the Russian Federation. That permission was given, and I'll get much more into detail in that on a later segment. And also Tomahawk missiles. Tomahawk missiles, there is the problem that Ukraine does not have the launch platforms for Tomahawk missiles, but there were rumors and talks that Ukraine would be receiving these Tomahawks for use against Russia, or perhaps even against Moscow itself, until mid-October, where, once again, Trump thought that he could be the peacemaker. This is coming off of the peace deal in Gaza with Israel, and I guess Trump thought he could take the show on the road, leading to a phone call with Zelensky on the 16th, followed up by a phone call with Vladimir Putin on the 17th. In both of these phone calls, the main theme was calling on them to support a ceasefire, with that ceasefire being used as the beginning point for further peace negotiations working towards a final status agreement. So, with this ceasefire deal, we have Steve Witkoff. Now, Witkoff has been someone who's been around for this entire thing, been talking about this whole episode. He is the point man for negotiations between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, and he put together a little preliminary peace deal, I guess we can call it, that the United States would be pushing on Ukraine and theoretically pushing on Russia, but they don't have the same levers to push on Russia. And the terms of this peace deal, however, come from Witkoff being a purposeful idiot. I say purposeful because, as I've explained in previous episodes, he is a New York real estate lawyer, which means he's a mob lawyer, which means he knows what he's not supposed to know. His ignorance is on purpose. But as it stood, the American interpretation of a peace deal would be that there would be a full ceasefire along the current line of contact, followed up by Ukraine ceding the remainder of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts to Russia, which would, by the way, mean that Russia would take command over many of Ukraine's strongest defensive positions, leading to a future war where they don't have to deal with those defensive positions, while the Americans also interpreted part of this deal to be that Russia would give up control of the Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, at least a portion of them. And as that idea was presented by Witkoff, would mean that Russia would be withdrawing from parts of those regions, perhaps most of those regions. However, that is stupid and wrong. The Russian interpretation of that meant that Kherson and Zaporizhia were entirely Russian territories, including the part that they do not and have never occupied, including the city of Zaporizhia itself, a very large and very easily defensible city straddling the Dnipro River, meaning an assault on Zaporizhia would mean fighting on both sides of the Dnipro at the same time, and not something that Russia has ever shown the ability to do at any point in this war. And the concession that Russia was making was that they'd no longer be claiming these parts, the unoccupied parts of these regions. The thing that Russia would give up were things that they never held to begin with. And this could be a reasonable error if you've never spoken to the Russians before, if you had never encountered Russian demands before, if you've never seen anything about Russian peace proposals before. Maybe you could make this mistake. However, Witkoff is the lead negotiator and has been for months now, and he made this exact same error before. In the previous round of negotiation, this was the miscommunication that ultimately sank it. Witkoff was a mouthpiece for Russian demands and lying about what they were, and I am saying lying. I'm not saying he misunderstood them. I'm saying he is lying about them. I'm saying he knew what they were because it was his job to do so, and had already made this mistake in the past and had been corrected on that mistake by literally everybody, including the Russians. This is not an honest mistake. This is Witkoff once again presenting Russian demands and wrapping them in a more pleasant packaging. So that was what the peace proposal was supposed to be. But where would this peace proposal be presented? And the answer for that was Budapest. Now, I think this is probably because Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, made this proposal himself. Viktor Orban is presenting himself in Europe as the one European leader who is trying to make peace. And in the elections next year, that is his main pitch, that he is the peace candidate that is keeping Hungary out of war because Ukrainians are trying to force Hungary to join the war on their side so Hungarians get killed. Well, Viktor Orban, the great peacemaker, is trying to find a solution to this conflict. Again, refer to my previous episode specifically about Viktor Orban, or really even my previous news episode about how they've begun much more aggressive, even military hostilities against Ukraine. But Orban wants to be this central figure in Europe. He is very much kissing up to Trump. Orban is the most Trumpian leader in Europe, to the point where I'd even say that Trump is more of an Orban type leader more than the other way around. Though there are, again, some problems with Budapest as a location for this. One, we had the Budapest Memorandum. This was the agreement in which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weaponry in exchange for the United States and Russia agreeing to respect their territorial sovereignty and responding in some way, though it's a very weak agreement, in some way, consultations if one or the other violates Ukrainian sovereignty. Ukraine gave up its nukes on the promise that Russia would intervene to protect Ukrainian sovereignty against the United States and the United States against Russia. We all know where that went. And the symbolic nature of that was commented on even to the White House spokesperson, and the White House spokesperson, in her eminent grace, simply said to the journalist who asked about that, quote, "Your mom was the person who decided on that location, because we are run by children." And the other problem with this Budapest meeting was it was very unclear if Ukraine was invited or not. It was not explicitly stated that Ukraine would not be there, but also Ukraine wasn't invited to go either, mostly because this Budapest meeting never really existed. It was just a thing that people said. There was no planning for it whatsoever. And even now, it wasn't really properly canceled. It might be at some point 100% officially canceled, but it was more of a gradual not talking about it anymore. It just kind of ghosted the idea. And even after everyone else stopped talking about it, again, there's a thing that happened over the course of 2 weeks. There was very easy. It was very odd, I should say, that this became old news so quickly, that this happened literally at the midpoint of the month, and at the end of the month, it's already nothing. But even after everyone else was done talking about this Budapest meeting, Orban was still talking about it as a way of pretending like he was still big man in charge. And like everything else, this round of talks for peace pittered away into nothing, and now it's over to the point where Trump kind of gave up on it entirely. He made some statements about how things were going as they were going or something like that, but they've stopped trying this time. So we have to look at where we ended at the round of this round of negotiations, rather. One, Russia once again frustrated the White House, and Ukraine again made sure that they were the ones who were not obstructing things. And ultimately, because so much of this round of negotiations was really a wet fart compared to the previous ones, there was so much more Sturm und Drang about the Alaska summit. Throughout the whole of the spring, there was so much just direct hostility towards Ukraine as being the ones who were saying no to peace while the Russians were being so generous. And this time around, we didn't really get that. Yes, the right-wing media was fully prepared for the pro-Russian talking points, but they quickly lost interest, and I do feel good about that. They're certainly still pretty hostile towards Ukraine, but they're bored, and I think everyone else resisting Trump should take this as a lesson in various ways in which the Trump regime is doing bad things. They are easily distracted, they do not have stamina, and they can be outlasted. Take advantage of this. That said, any talk of Tomahawk missiles being sent to Ukraine is now over. It may be revived at a later point, but as of right now, it's over. Maybe when things cool down a bit more, maybe someone in the Defense Department will kind of slip it back in, but as of right now, it's over. Trump himself said that the permission for the Storm Shadows was never given, though I think he was just confusing it for Tomahawks. I am pretty certain that when people asked him if the Storm Shadow permissions were given and he said no, and he did say no, he was actually thinking about Tomahawks and not Storm Shadows. I'm pretty sure that's it because I did not hear any other news about Storm Shadows being denied to Ukraine. I think he's just old and confused about things. A missile is a missile, easy thing to get confused about. And that sanction package in the Senate, at first it was stalled out so that diplomacy could happen, but they're talking about introducing it again. Round and around we go on that Senate sanctions package. But there is another important set of sanctions that the United States put in place. Now, I said at the very beginning, I said when Trump was elected in my post-election breakdown episode, you can go back and listen to it, and it's something I was correct about, is that while American support for Ukraine could disappear in every other way, I did believe that the Trump administration would still take actions against the Russian fossil fuel industry, oil and natural gas. Because oil and natural gas by Russia is a competitor for the United States wants countries to stop buying fossil fuels from Russia and buy them from the United States instead. And therefore, the White House would still take action on those. And that is something that we have seen in various ways. And this is theoretically, possibly, the strongest expression of that thus far. The United States did put direct sanctions on Russia's oil and natural gas industries, as well as secondary sanctions on anyone who'd do business with them, meaning that we have already seen Chinese natural gas state companies put a pause on their buys from Russia. We've seen India talking about that. We have seen, even into Europe, the halt on Russian natural gas purchases. This is super important. The Russian economy, especially the Russian government, is reliant on the export of oil and natural gas. Russia is a very naturally wealthy country. In addition to oil and natural gas, it also has a ton of minerals. Russia's wealth is beneath the soil, and that's a lot of wealth. It's a big country with a lot of deposits of various things. And getting other countries in the world to stop buying from Russia has been like pulling teeth. India, especially, very reliant on Russia. China, very reliant on import of Russian energy, though now at pretty predatory rates, I must say. China's really taken advantage of this war situation for themselves. And it has always been known that if you're able to put a full, proper embargo, I would prefer a blockade, on Russia to prevent them from exporting their oil and natural gas, the Russian ability to carry out this war will disappear. They will not be able to afford it. Russia exports natural resources and it builds weapons. That's their economy. Take those out and they have very little. And Russia has used its ability to summon more resources than Ukraine is able to great effect. They're able to pay their soldiers better. Their soldiers get big signing bonuses that in some regions are just an unfathomable amount of money. And that is what allows them to have their standing military. Without the ability to pay those sign-up bonuses, they don't have an army anymore without doing forced conscription, which is something they have long avoided. This is a war of attrition, and Russia's ability to carry out a war of attrition is contingent on them being able to sell oil and natural gas. And if these sanctions work as they are sold as working, they will not be able to do that. This could be a massive, massive help to Ukraine, but that's a big if, very big if. And so I have to throw some cold water on this idea. And that is that the American ability to enforce sanctions right now is extremely weak. These sanctions are enforced largely through the Treasury Department. And as we have covered in the past, the U.S. Treasury Department has severely hindered its ability to enforce sanctions. They have fired much of the staff that did that and put much of the remainder on furlough, which means it'll be quite difficult for, say, a country being watched by the United States to go to Russia directly and say, I would like to buy this barrel of oil, please, and I will be taking it back to my country on this truck with my country's flag on it. Those sanctions will make that pretty difficult to carry out. But there's a lot of sanctions on Russia already, and we know how they get around them. That's through shell companies, through third countries, and though secondary sanctions could apply to these countries for dealing business with Russia on others' behalf, someone has to actually investigate that that's what's happening, and there's not many people at Treasury Department left to investigate that. So just put a little bit of effort into sanctions evasion, and no one's there to police it. A law without enforcement is not a real law. And secondly, these sanctions are being treated much the same way that the United States is treating tariffs, and that they can change at any time. Throughout the Trump presidency, tariffs have been added and subtracted pretty much at a whim. It's completely random, it seems, at times. To the point where it's now baked in to the U.S. stock market. If you know that tariffs are going to harm a particular industry, the next day there will be, a dip in prices of the stock for that industry. That's when you can buy them up. And so when those tariffs are taken away later, you can sell them at a higher price. And this is going to be something I'm going to talk about more in the Polycrisis series. Further away, this is a further down the line episode, is how this basically led to an entire system of insider trading, where if you know when and upon who the tariffs will be put in place, you'll know when to buy low and sell high. This should all be illegal. But anyway, the point is that these sanctions can come and go. We already saw that with the Alaska summit. The reason, again, for the Alaska summit was that I was able to forestall sanctions on Russia's fossil fuel industry. However, other countries had already been hit by secondary sanctions at that time, especially India. India had a lot of sanctions put on it by the United States because they were doing business with Russian fossil fuels, only for then, a week later, the demand for sanctions on Russia disappeared, meaning that India was kind of left with the bill on an issue that was no longer even relevant. And this unpredictability, like I said with the stock exchange thing, is now built into the system. Countries know that Trump is mercurial, that he'll change his mind about something, that there will be another push for peace or something at a later point at when these sanctions can be lifted, and so they just need to wait it out. So right now, China is making a show of pausing their purchases from Russia, but they know that America will lose interest soon enough. And in the time between then and now, they can just do sanctions evasion through third parties, which for the reasons stated about sanctions enforcement, they know how to do. They're like, I don't believe that China's about to actually stop purchases from Russia on this. That seems far-fetched. If it actually happens, that would be wonderful. Greatest thing in the world. But I just don't see it. So to round this all off, I certainly hope that these sanctions work. In theory, they should be devastating for Russia and severely cripple their ability to make war. In practice, I think it's full of holes. But the last thing to say about this round of negotiations is about what I have to call WhiteHouseology. Now, in Russia, there has been this practice of Kremlinology where, because it's not a very democratic system and is very much based around Vladimir Putin and his court at any given time, and seeing who is thinking what within that court is how you understand Russian politics in the absence of, real politics. Every Russia expert is paying very close attention to whatever member of the Russian cabinet, whatever senior advisors happen to have the ear of Vladimir Putin at any given time and who has fallen out of favor. That's how you tell Russian politics. And that is now how we have to look at American politics. Because Trump is so unstable and likely senile, we have to look at what is happening in the next row down. The cabinet, advisors, that kind of thing, who is able to have influence. And the first thing we have to look at with this WhiteHouseology deals with the storm shadows. And I do think that the storm shadow permission is extremely important into understanding how the United States government works right now. And I'm quite frustrated that American media has not picked up on it because it is so demonstrative of how things are going. So beforehand, the ability to give or retract permissions on the use of American military equipment in Europe came directly from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, or now Secretary of War. He changed the name of Secretary of Defense of the Department of Defense to the Department of War because he's a child. And Hegseth was one saying no. Hegseth is very much a part of the anti-Ukraine camp within the presidency. But it seems as though through one mechanism or another, which is quite opaque and I don't understand it fully, the authority to give that permission was instead devolved down to the head of the United States European Command, or EUCOM, and that is Air Force General Grunkevich. And in his position as the head of the European Command, he is also the supreme commander of NATO. And like his predecessors in that position, is much more friendly to Ukraine and hostile to Russia. And this shows a pretty big gap between the civilian command of the Defense Department and the military itself. In most circumstances, this would be a bad thing for a democracy. When the military starts to go around their civilian oversight represented by the Secretary of Defense, that's some scary stuff under normal circumstances. In this circumstance, however, it is fantastic. It really seems as though the actual command of the United States military is much more concerned about democracy than the civilian government. And if they're able to get around that civilian oversight, in this case, yes, please. And the reasons for this split are not just a matter of policy. It's not just a matter of how Hegseth is more Russia-friendly, while the generals are more Ukraine-friendly. It's a personal one. Pete Hegseth is a clown. He should not be in charge of anything. He was at one point, of course, an officer in the United States military, did not have a particularly stellar career, but was an infantry officer. And his career after that, into the media, really shows someone who would much rather be working the motivation circuit. He wants to be the guy writing books about leadership. He wants to be the guy who Silicon Valley CEOs will pay him thousands of dollars for him to scream at them in a parking lot at 3 o'clock in the morning, telling them they have to be proper providers for their families and how they're failing because they don't understand some made-up word about leadership and determination or something like that, in order to give their lives meaning on some stupid masculinist level because they've never experienced hardship in their lives, and by signing up for this boot camp, they will be able to think of themselves as warriors in the accounting industry or something. He wants to be the guy who is on TV talking about how the military is too soft and womanly these days. And that's what he actually does. That's what most of his job has been. Most of his job has been about photo ops, about looking tough, about selling whatever book he decides to come out with. The Secretary of Defense is supposed to be the person in charge of the largest bureaucratic organ of the United States government, handling not only the United States military, but also the various civilian offices that exist to support it. This is a tremendous challenge for any manager, and he's just not doing that because he's a child. At one point, he even called in all of his generals and flag officers to get into a room and have a big old pep talk. Recalled them from all over the world to sit in on his speech about how they have to be tougher and how they have to do physical training with the troops. Okay, sure, buddy. And how they have to purge the military of unloyal elements. And of course, the flag officers don't enjoy this. They don't enjoy being made into a captive audience for his stupid motivational speech. For all the possible failings they can point at for the United States military, these tend to be quite serious people who, in the words of Tommy Lee Jones on the set of Batman Forever, cannot sanction this buffoonery. But they're forced to, and they don't like it, so we will be seeing further splits. We do know that the Pentagon is not enjoying their boss. We do know that there is miserable levels of morale within the managerial level of the United States military because of this, and therefore a split between, again, the military and its civilian oversight with Pete Hegseth. And of course, since we are talking about the permission for these storm shadows and Trump saying that he did not give that permission. On the surface, that does seem like a contradiction between General Grinkiewicz and Donald Trump, the commander-in-chief, which could be a bigger problem, but like I said, I think that was just confusion. And the other thing I want to talk about is about these sanctions. And there is very clearly now a more Russia hostile faction within the cabinet that is pushing for sanctions and other actions against Russia. This faction is made up by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Scott Bessent was even doing some tough talk when Russia's kind of business envoy, I guess we can call him, Kirill Dmitriev, showed up in the United States and said that sanctions would do nothing, Russia strong, that kind of thing. And Bessent kind of mocked him for it. Like pretty open hostility towards Dmitriev on this level. Dmitriev, more so than everyone else on the Russian side, has really been overstepping and antagonizing the Americans in ways that are deeply unwise. Good for us, unwise for him. And Rubio and Bessent worked to put this sanctions in place on the fossil fuel industry, and we will be seeing the kind of Rubio-Bessent team working at odds with the more pro-Russian side of things in Pete Hegseth and Vice President J.D. Vance. Those seem to be the two poles, and whoever can grab onto Trump at any given time will decide on what policy it will have really that week, and who knows what will happen the week after. But again, we do have to go back to this problem with Treasury Secretary, because Bessent is in charge of the Department of the Treasury, and therefore in charge of enforcing those sanctions that he pushed for and did all this tough talk on and was very kind of performative about, but that's just rhetoric. If you look at the actions, you have that problem that I already talked about. Bessent himself oversaw the dismantling of the Treasury Department's and sanctions enforcement mechanisms. He could put those back into place, and he has not. If he was serious about these sanctions, it is his responsibility to put those enforcement investigators and others back on the job in order to enforce these sanctions. He has not done so. So to me, it's a lot of rhetoric. So those are the two biggest points of WhiteHouseology on here, but that's really what we have to be paying attention to, is who is talking to Trump and who is following through on their actions. And that kind of concludes of where we are standing now with this peace process and the things that came out of it, such as this sanctions package. But there's one more thing I'm going to talk about this episode, in that as America is doing all this about pushing forward, albeit very flawed, we can say, peace proposals, what that does is it leads the Europeans in the lurch. America is taking the lead, and they're being very irresponsible with that lead. Something that can be said about everything. But the Europeans had to have a counter. They had to show up with their own peace proposal, and they did so. They recently, just this last few days, came out with a 12-point plan. I'll kind of speed through what kind of these points are rather than deal with the entire thing. But this peace plan is still very, very flawed. The first idea, ceasefire, of course. All peace plans have to begin with a ceasefire, but that ceasefire would be followed up with different confidence building measures. And those confidence building measures seems to be that Russia would be invited back into international organizations, primarily the International Olympic Committee, which means that the normalization process could begin before there's any actual plans in place for peace. What are they going to do? Invite Russia back into these international organizations and then expel them again 2 months later? That doesn't seem realistic. Once they're back in, they're back in. And so these confidence building measures, which are doomed to fail, are just a free gift to Russia. Absurdity. Another point of this is that the negotiations on the quote final line of contact, which will remain in effect until the parties have agreed on permanent governance of the occupied territories. It is built into this peace plan that Russia will annex the occupied territories, and that part of the peace plan will be on how that occupation will be governed. And I'm sorry, but no peace plan will tell Russia how to govern what they see as a part of their own country. They won't abide by anything. This is pointless. The buffer zones will be part of it. Security guarantees. Again, security guarantees mean absolutely nothing. Say Ukraine joins NATO or it's all pointless. There's another point in there that there would be, quote, increased mutual understanding and respect for diversity of language, culture, and religion. Just giving in to the Russian framing of the war that is about protecting Russian speakers, Russian culture, and Russian religion while they're being persecuted in Ukraine. And that a peace agreement will involve Ukraine have to give more rights that they never took away, by the way, from minorities. And I do think that any peace agreement with Russia would involve something like this. It's something that, because there's no actual persecution, would be very easy to implement, but extraordinarily dangerous to give credence to Russian propaganda. Respect for diversity. Yeah, that's the thing that Russia has issue with. Reconstruction fund and also lifting of sanctions for Russia. And of course, any peace agreement with Russia would involve the lifting of sanctions, but any giving back of control to Russia of their frozen assets in Europe. And right now, there's about 200 billion euros worth of Russian assets that are being frozen right now. If Russia has any opportunity to move that money into something safer, they're gonna take it. And no amount of saying that you'll reimpose sanctions later will get around that. Giving Russia time to breathe on sanctions, even if violating the peace agreement would mean sanctions go back, just means they're able to make themselves more resilient to sanctions, get their money somewhere safer. So all these half measures leading up to a peace agreement are stupid because Russia has no intention of eventually leading to true final peace, and therefore everything's temporary, and any amount of giving into that is just facilitating the next Russian war. It's a terrible plan. I hate every part of this plan. Every point is bad. But that leads to another statement being quoted in every article about this, so I'll share it as well. One European diplomat said, "We can have a 12-point plan, but there won't be peace. That is Putin's 1-point plan." So yeah, everyone knows. Everyone knows this entire exercise is pointless, but by rhetorically meeting Russia halfway about respect for diversity and all that, you're already giving Russia parts of what it wants. Stand strong for once. That isn't Europe's forte now, is it? With that is going to be how I'm going to be ending our episode. That is the story of the latest round of negotiations. There were no negotiations. Everyone knows there won't be negotiations, except for the strange fixations and delusions of a man quite literally with dementia. So that closes our episode. If you would like more information about Ukraine, more resources, more charities you can go to our link tree in the description. If you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. We really need your help right now. I don't enjoy begging, but difficult money situation at the moment due to a variety of factors. So if you could help this project be sustainable. It's looking like it will be a very important part of my own stability. So hit that Patreon, please. That is my marketing pitch, I suppose. And of course, to thank all of our current Patreon subscribers. Thank you very much to Randy McNerlin, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivanika Kratskaya, Mike, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, T. Bart, Barbara, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Jane Louise, Marguerite, Kevin Alberton, Silas Frank, Dimitri Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Megan, Kyle Smith, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazin, Andy S., Sanjay, Noam, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, Justin Devendorf, David Wall, Chris Bennington, Levy Grove, James Wise, Alex Schrochmal, Aidan McDowell, George, Victor Mate, Scott Tokariuk, Etienne Soleil, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Evelyn, Veronica Aim, Matt Miller, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, Marianne, RDK, Francois, Lori Halila, Justin R., Christopher Yee, Kyle Johnson, Lemonican, Demetrio, Ursula, Noah Brown, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Marcus Nashkus, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Brown, Abel Lenz, Denna Jones, Joseph Erloni, Yellow Duck, Anonymous, and Bucktrown 2021. Thank you all very much for your support. You would make this all possible. And until next time, Slava Ukraini!